Dr. Mandaza, good morning. Right.
Can you hear me?
Can you
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Thank you.
Now let's compare, Doctor, as we start our conversation, let's compare the previous elections in Zimbabwe. I know I've been voting for many years in Zimbabwe. Let's compare the mood then in 1980, in 2013, 2018, the mood as compared to the mood now. How is the mood like? Can you say the mood is the same or it has changed?
It's very difficult to say. I have a feeling that 1980 was something else. I mean, it was the first time for us to vote, and notwithstanding the security situation during the ceasefire, I came back during the ceasefire, so it was quite historic in its own sense. Subsequent elections were marred by violence. 1985. The one-party state specter was all over the place. So you had other parties, including ZAPU, under siege. In fact, I want to say that from independence, the tendency of the ZANU-PF state was to regard every opposition as enemy, whether it was ZAPU under Joshua Nkomo, whether it was Zoom under Edgar Tekere, whether it was MDC under Morgan Changira, and now the tendency has been, unfortunately, one of regarding the opposition as enemy, to be vanquished, not to be tolerated at all. So I would say that most elections have been marked or have been characterized by that kind of siege mentality, if I may put it, in which the ruling party, the state, and the state have sought to vanquish the opposition. And I think 2023 is not different, really, if you see what's happening to the opposition. The rallies are being banned. There's hardly any mention of them in the state media. There is generally a kind of bare tolerance, especially now that observers have arrived, a tendency to try and create an atmosphere of even play field. But the reality is quite otherwise. I mean, I would say that this election in particular has been most what can I say, most desperate on the part of the ruling party, especially its presidential candidate. The manner in which money has been thrown around since December, the extent to which freebies are being distributed at rallies, goats, and what have you. I've never seen such desperation on the part of a presidential candidate like I have seen now. I think in the past, Mugabe knew that his boys and girls were at work in rigging, as they did. I think this time around, Mnangagwa is not sure that his boys and girls are in one mind, with regard to himself. He's not sure at all. So that is added to the desperation, in my view.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mandaza, for answering that question. Maybe you were speaking about campaigns and putting money into a campaign and all that. Let's talk about manifestos now. What is the importance of a manifesto? What is the importance of a manifesto in an election?
Well, a manifesto is supposed to be the sort of ideology, the promise, the agenda of a particular party in relation to the election, and in particular in attracting voters to itself. It's usually a very important instrument in any election. It outlines policies in great detail, both political and economic. But sadly, in manifesto become less and less important. Not to mention that then less and less visible. I mean, you heard ZANU PF saying over the weekend that the manifestos are their actions, which has attracted a ridicule. People saying, "Well, you're talking about your actions as in corruption, in misgovernance, mismanagement of the economy." So you have it, and then you have also the Triple C. I don't think they have any manifesto yet. If there is, I probably missed it. But I see Kasukuwere this morning has published his manifesto, a very lengthy one. So manifestos are normally important in outlining the ideology and objectives of a particular party. But nowadays, these are reduced. Manifestos are reduced to a competition for power, in which the ruling party wants to stay in power, and the opposition wants to take over power. So that's what manifestos have been reduced to now, sadly.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, speaking of manifestos, right? I think last time we spoke about the importance of manifestos in Zimbabwe to say, do we vote based on manifestos or just vote based on popularity? Maybe just now goes to your question now.
Yes, my question was really on that, to say you spoke about how the ruling party is using money, and also you spoke about manifestos and that they are important, but now they've become less and less. And I was asking that, looking at Zimbabweans, what do they vote for? Yeah.
Is it for the manifestos or for the popularity?
Yeah.
I think they're voting, as I said earlier on. They are voting. Those who vote for ZANU PF want ZANU PF to stay in power, and those who vote for Triple C or vote against ZANU PF want ZANU PF out of power and want the Triple C in power. It's a competition for power. Mainly, I would say. You see, the history of elections, particularly in Africa, is that people normally vote against incumbency. That's why some of us in political economy and in relation to Zimbabwe, one can say from the 90s already, the vote was largely against ZANU PF. I said to Morgan Tsvangirai in 2008 that Mugabe lost. I said, Mugabe has lost the election by a landslide. And Morgan Tsvangirai said, you mean I won by a landslide? I said, no. I repeat, Mugabe lost by a landslide. In other words, the tendency of the vote since 2000 in particular has always been against the ruling party. And there's no reason to believe to be any different now. And even in places like Zambia, come next elections, one must expect that people will vote against HH, because the record of any government in Africa has tended to fall short of the promises they make when they come into power. The problems are so insurmountable in most cases, especially the issue of unemployment, social decay, and so on and so forth. So one does expect, and as I do, that the votes will go always against the incumbents in the Zimbabwe situation, and there's reason to believe that this would be the same. I mean, I find it difficult to understand why anybody would vote for the incumbent party, the ruling party, given the record of failure, given the record of corruption, the record of mismanagement. I find it difficult. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if as I do expect that the opposition would win. Not so much because of itself, but mainly because of the people's aversion to the ruling party.
Thanks so much, Doc, for that response this morning. Guys, if you're just joining us today, we're talking about Zimbabwe elections. We're interviewing Dr. Ibbo Mandaza. If you have any questions, please do type your questions on our timeline. They're going to read them out, or please do request the mic. We're going to give you the mic to speak. Now, Doctor, let's focus now on the issue of the courts now. We saw in 2018, the election was disputed in 2018. They further went to the court under MTC Alliance, then they went to the Court for Justice Malaba to rule on that. And then even now, 2023, we jump to that now to say Nomination Court Day. We saw UNZA President Elizabeth Valerio going to court and winning that. And we saw now Sylvia Kasukuwere in court again, challenging many things. And also see the CCC 12 candidates in Bulawayo also in court. Let's speak about the court and issue of elections. Is there a link between courts and elections in Zimbabwe in particular?
Yes, I think, regrettably, I mean, the judiciary is under scrutiny in Zimbabwe. And people have become very cynical about the judiciary, in which case almost every case has become predictable. And when there is what appears to be a fair conclusion in a court, it becomes more an exception than the rule. So I'm sorry to say that people have become very cynical about the judiciary in Zimbabwe. Hello?
Doc, are you still there? We can't hear you now.
No, I just finished what I was speaking.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much for responding to that. In terms of the courts, you say 2018 the courts intervened in Zimbabwe. Now even now, Nomination Court, the courts are still intervening. Yeah, maybe nothing I can do a follow up.
Yeah. Okay, mine is really on. He spoke about the political environment earlier on, and I would like to ask about the opposition parties. We've seen a lot of opposition parties coming up and all that. In your analysis, do you think that in this year there has been a growth? In terms of numbers and even in terms of the political parties themselves, getting rich and growing in general?
Well, it's difficult. I think, notwithstanding the number of parties, some of whom I don't even know. I mean, you have 11 presidential candidates, most of them standing with the party. I'm sorry to say I don't know many of them. Nor are they important. So it appears to me that the Zimbabwe remains very polarized between ZANU-PF and CCC, which was in the past MDC, in my view, which has not changed much in terms of its social base. So the two parties remain the critical factors in the Zimbabwean political space at the moment, except, of course, the presidential with the entry of Kasukuwere that has created a major problem for ZANU-PF in particular, but even for the opposition, for the CCC, raising the prospects of a runoff, if Kasukuwere is allowed to stand.
Okay, thanks so much, Doc, for that response. Guys, if you're just joining us, we're talking to Dr. Ibbo Mandaza, looking at Zimbabwe elections. If you have any questions, I'm seeing your hands there. I'm going to take your questions there this morning. Maybe before you go to our audience this morning, let's look at the issue of, you raised the issue of two-party states, right? Mm-hmm. Back then, there was ZAPU and ZANU, right? 2099, there was MDC and ZANU-PF. Now, 2023, there's ZANU-PF and CCC, Doctor. Now, the issue of only two parties in Zimbabwe, what's your take on that issue? Does Zimbabweans trust other parties besides ZANU-PF and CCC, or other parties besides those two major ones? Do they trust those other parties?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, they must have some kind of support to be standing as they are. I heard you in the news mention ZAPU, and I was at Mrs. Dabengwa's funeral 2 weeks ago, and ZAPU was very prominent there. So clearly, these small parties do have a social base of some sort, What I'm saying, however, is that the political space is dominated by the two parties, across the polity. Um, and I'm not saying this to demean or to underestimate the importance of small parties. In fact, I'd have hoped that we would have had a proportionate representation. And in the 2013 constitutional process, in fact, some of us wrote in and proposed proportional representation across. I think that's the ideal for Africa in particular, and for Zimbabwe uh, too, because this is where the small parties, however small, can be represented in the polity. And I'd hope that if there's a new government, that it will revert to a proportional representation and put aside this first past the post, which is completely, in my view, very undemocratic. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Doctor, for that response. Let's go to Leonard, our first speaker. Leonard, what's your question or contribution this morning to Dr. Ibbo Mandaza around Zimbabwe elections?
Thank you so much, Brighton. Thank you, Osad. Thank you, Nonhlanhla. Thank you, Dr. Ibbo. I just want to ask one question. It seems as if Emerson Mnangagwa is rattled by the coming in of Sevia Kasukuwere. Why is he afraid of... Hello? Can you hear
Yes, I
me?
can hear you. I can hear
Yes, you
you.
can hear
Yes. Yeah. Why is Emerson Mnangagwa rattled by the inclusion of Sevia Kasukuwere? And secondly, in the event that Sevia Kasukuwere has been allowed to contest in this 2023 election, what is likely to happen to the votes which were supposed to go to Emerson Mnangagwa? Thank you so much.
Yes,
Doc?
yes. Mnangagwa is justified in feeling uncomfortable, to use your term, rattled by the inclusion of Xavier Kasukuwere. We have to go back to the coup of 2017. The coup was essentially an implosion within ZANU-PF itself, in which case one faction lost to Mnangagwa's faction. So that's the first thing. ZANU-PF has been split right down the middle in 2017. Some of us would say that it was a fatal split, meaning that in my view, it was the beginning of the end of the current regime. How long it take to disintegrate, we don't know, but basically it marked the end. So you must remember the backdrop of this split in ZANU-PF. Secondly, Kasukuwere belongs to that faction which lost in 2017, and one might say that they are fighting back. And one must take it for granted that that faction that lost in 2017, including Mugabe, they still have a social base in Zimbabwe. And thirdly, the extent to which there's the ethnic factor, the extent to which the Mnangagwa regime has been or is viewed as being an ethnic collusion, in the manner in which people of the same clan, even his family, have colluded around Mnangagwa since 2017, has added a kind of a pronounced ethnic collusion within the regime. And this in turn has, I mean, you heard the talk, for example, Mnangagwa's people saying, well, The Zulu were in power for 43 years, now it's our turn, and so on and so forth. This ethnic talk has become contagious in many respects. So one might expect that, therefore, the Shonaland provinces, for example, would tend to go along with Kasukuwere. But more important for me is that the stature of Mnangagwa himself, as a person who has never been elected before, and whose election in 2018 was heavily disputed. But even on the basis of the data, the official data on the elections of 2018, Mnangagwa lost in 118 constituencies, 118 out of 210. Significantly, ZANU-PF won 9 seats in Matabele North, but Mnangagwa got 5% of the vote. ZANU-PF won 23 out of 26 seats in Mandikaland, and Mnangagwa lost in that province. And Mnangagwa even lost in Midlands, in Shirugi, for example, he lost there. So that spectre, that backdrop, is bound to be dominant in the mind of people like Mnangagwa himself, knowing that we are very delicately poised in the electoral process, knowing that your misfortunes may actually have increased since 2018, given the talk and allegations of corruption, given the evident mismanagement of the economy, given the evident, where can I say, misgovernance, abuse of human rights, and so on and so forth. So I would expect, Mnangagwa should expect and should know that his chances are less and less hopeful, in my view. And therefore, the Kasukuwere entry just compounds the problem for him. No doubt about that.
Well, thanks so much for that response. Let's go to another speaker there this morning. Citezw, good morning, sir. Welcome to this morning. What's your question and contribution this morning to Dr. Ibbo Mandaza?
Thank you, Brighton. Hello, Nonhlanhla, and everyone on space. It's a pleasure interacting with you, Dr. Mandaza. In your presentation, in your presentation, you highlighted that the judiciary is under the spotlight. I've got 2 questions that follow. Under whose spotlight is this judiciary in? Because as we stand, we see the incumbent using the courts to fight the opposition. In the history of elections, we haven't seen incumbents using the courts. What prompts ZANU-PF to use the courts like we see in Kasukuwere and the CCC, Blawayo 12, and some countrywide? Secondly, in your view as a political scientist, is the opposition in a good standing to defeat ZANU-PF? If so, what are the chances of a smooth power transfer after winning? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, a lot of questions there. There's a new term used by lawyers these days, the weaponization of the law, lawfare. And you are right to say that this has become much more pronounced in the last 2 elections, 2018 and 2023. And therefore, the suspicion therein that the executive, Mnangagwa in particular, regards the courts as a very important weapon to both attack the opposition and to defend himself against the opposition. And this has become a widespread, a largely shared suspicion in the society. And as I said earlier on, this has caused people to be suspicious of all court cases. I mean, the biggest, when I say biggest slur against the judiciary is the manner in which Job Sekala, for example, has been treated. You know, where you can actually see almost a regimentation of the judicial process against him. So, so basically, the judiciary has become more and more associated with the executive, with Mnangagwa in particular. And this is not to say that every judge is in that category. There are very fine legal minds in the judiciary in Zimbabwe, but it is clear that the Chief Justice in particular is one regarded as largely Mnangagwa's man. Now, to come to the possible outcome of the elections, first of all, I would have to say that the situation is very, very heavily geared against the opposition. If you look, for example, Sapes Trust and Rao ran a series of webinars since August last year, which were intended to audit the electoral process and ask the big question: will the elections in 2023 be free, fair, and credible? And the conclusion of the experts who spoke variously over the last 8 months, 9 months, was that the elections are unlikely to be free, fair, and credible. That they were likely to have another disputed election. That's one. Number two, the measures taken against the opposition. One, the nature of the delimitation report, the sloth with which the voters' roll has been emerging, the various problems being identified by people like Pachedu, which show that the attempts to rig are evident throughout. The specter of the so-called FAS and the operations across the country, the extent to which the opposition has been denied access to rural areas, which in many cases the opposition, Triple C itself, tends to underplay by occasionally making inroads. But one observation that some of us have is that the Triple C is unlikely to perform well in the rural areas, which in my view appear already captured by the ruling party through coercion, through regimentation of the headmen and the traditional leaders in the rural areas, and even attempts to manage on the day of the election the voting pattern in the rural areas. So it's difficult to be sure, while it's clear that notwithstanding these problems, Chamisa will still perform well as a leader. I begin to doubt whether they will get as many seats as they expect in the rural areas. So we can't rule out a disputed election, certainly, with this very, very suspicious cloud of rigging in the background. It appears to me that ZANU-PF and the state has prepared vigorously for this election, long in advance, since 2013. If you remember, 2013 was a big pushback on the part of ZANU-PF, having lost in 2008, especially the presidential. So now, the kind of extraordinary measures they've taken in preparing, in launching fairs, I'm told fairs got $10 million for its operations. The extent to which ZANU-PF has really scoured the rural areas, I've never seen anything like that before. Even though 2008 was the runoff was terribly violent, but this time around, the operations that we get about as to the role of fairs are quite astounding. So I'm sorry, I can't say with any confidence that the opposition will win outright. It's really very doubtful in my view. And because, to be very frank, the specter of rigging hovers in the background. I noticed, for example, the headline in the Newsday yesterday was misinterpreted. I'm sure that Chamisa meant that we should do everything to counter rigging, and by a slight error in my view, in terms of the coining of the headline, gave the impression that Mnangagwa will not rig this time round. Uh, and of course, the ruling party jumped on that, and so on and so forth. But basically, rigging is in process in this country at the moment. One doesn't know the details of it outright, but basically, when you see the various flaws in the delimitation, the various flaws in the voters' roll, one is led to believe that rigging is on a big scale. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mandaza, for responding to those questions. But also, Dr. Yesterday, during the Observer and Diplomats meeting in Harare, where observers came, Zimbabwe, and also diplomats, these figures were presented to the observers and diplomats. Police have blocked 86 gatherings of the ruling party ZANU-PF between January 1 and July 10. And then police have banned 65 Triple C rallies during the same period. That's Nick Mangwana tweeting here about the Observer and Diplomats meeting. Let's look back now in terms of 1980s, 90s, where ZAP was still present and visible. Were rallies banned the same way they are being banned now for the opposition parties? And what was happening there? What's your experience? What did you see that time, during that time?
Yeah, I think there was very, very pronounced intolerance towards opposition, as I said earlier on. Uh, I can't recall clearly, but I know that 1985 elections, in particular, were very marred by the. Remember, it also you had the Gukurahundi in the backdrop. Huh? So Zapu was under siege, terribly so. You know, to the point that the 1985 elections were farcical in my view. So, and this has been the pattern since 2000. The, the 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 ruling party's intolerance of any other of all the opposition, and sadly that pattern has continued to this day.
Well, thank you so much, Doc, for responding to that. Let's hear from Bento. Good morning, Bento. What's your question to Dr. Mandaza this morning?
Good morning, Nonhlanhla and Brighton. Yeah, I've got one question for Mr. Mandaza. I mean, Dr. Mandaza, and a few issues to debunk from his submission. The first one, look, I've got nothing against you, but these are mamas which have been in the corridors for a long time. That the doctor belongs to a clique of the Zezuru Unconquerable, who had put a vow that there's no Karanga or Ndebele or Manyika who rule the country. And the people view him as a bitter man because of sees that kind of tribalism. So it's an opportunity for him to shed light on this issue. The other thing is about his criticism of the political parties for not putting manifestos. The manifesto, these are old style communiques by socialist parties, especially in the past, to communicate with their people for their aims and objectives. For ZANU-PF, they have the NDS1. That's enough. They don't need to rewrite anything. Then for the government to give people chickens, goats, seed in the rural areas, it happens everywhere where governments, especially in the developed world, try to stimulate certain sections of the economy. We know that the rural economy is agricultural. That's growing crops and rearing livestock, and that is an area which we, the government, need to prop up because it's got the majority of the people. It gives the rural people an alternative line of a stream of revenue. It's goats, chickens are delicates too. So I don't think this is vote buying, but any responsible government does that to try and stimulate the economy. Then on the issue of Chamisa saying that these elections, Mnangagwa says he said the president will not rig elections. I've seen him. He has also joined the parade for speaking for Chamisa. Chamisa said straight with his face, but I see there are a lot of people who rush to say no, he didn't want to say this, and the doctor seems he has fallen into the same step. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bernard, for that contribution.
Doc, we can respond to that. Please unmute your mic and respond to those questions by Bernard.
Yes, well, there are a lot of questions. The first, of course, is about by alleged tribal collusion. Of course, I've heard those accusations, which are merely accusations. There is no evidence at all that I am part of a collusion. Yes, I'm of the Zulu background, but I doubt that anyone can find evidence that I've put that into political plans. First of all, I've not been in the political space at all. As I was member of the liberation movement, yes, but I came in as a civil servant throughout. I've never held political office, so that is only an accusation, and I don't know how to deal with it. The second question was on manifestos. Well, I don't know. That's his personal view on manifestos, but generally, there are elections the world over always accompanied by manifestos, which are meant to create a distinction between parties, or contestation or a binary situation. But to the extent to which manifestos have become unimportant in his view is a reflection of the poverty of politics in our country. That the politics have been reduced to mere competition for power, for the ruling party to retain power and the opposition to take over power, with no. For example, I've complained many times myself that the opposition has so far failed to project an alternative policy, and certainly when it came to the GNU, it was difficult to cite a difference between MDC and ZANU-PF in terms of their political and policy positions throughout the GNU. So that indeed, in my view, therefore, politics in Zimbabwe is reduced to a competition for power. The ZANU-PF seeking to retain power forever, and Triple C seeking to take over power. Simple as that. The last question had to do with the headline yesterday in the Newsday. No, I didn't see. I did not see or hear Chamisa making a statement, so I cannot, with confidence, speak on that. But all I can say is that it would have been very ridiculous for Chamisa to say there will be no rigging. I find it difficult to accept. And given what I've just said about the rigging machinery being at work, I'm quite sure that Chamisa meant precisely what I said he meant, that we must do everything to thwart rigging. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much, Doctor, for that response. Guys, if you're just joining us this morning on Saki, you're talking to Dr. Ibbo Mandaza on Zimbabwe elections, and we're hearing from him issue of manifestos, the importance of manifestos, giving us a comparative study on previous elections from 1980 up to present day. Let's go to another speaker there this morning. Kolite Baba Nivuka njani?
Siyavuka baba Ncube, livuka njani lani? Thanks to you, Nonhlanhla, as well, and Dr. Ibbo Mandaza, and everyone else in the space. Mine isn't just a question, but I just want to ask, do you foresee any possibility of a Zimbabwe whereby in politics we will see politicians alike having a political debate, one, two, kind of fighting on policies, on who's got better policies than the other, and implementing those policies and becoming accountable to the electorate? Or is it that we've been kind of relegated to poverty and with our current politics forever? Thank you.
Yes, as I said, I mentioned, I used the term earlier on, poverty of our politics, and I think you have summarized it very well. We have a legacy as a country of a state which is intolerant of opposition, which has besieged opposition movements since independence, whether it was ZAPU, Zoom, MDC, and now CCC, where every election has become a battlefield, so to speak, accompanied by violence. And as happened in 2008, deaths, 300 people killed during the runoff. And so I've grown now to be averse to elections, to fear elections. Like one of my uncles who was now late complained when he heard that there were elections in 2013, says, my election's 40. You know, people fear, the rural people in particular fear elections because it's an era, it's a period of regimentation, passed from one area to another, and so on and so forth. So really, our politics really are in a bad state, if I may put it. How soon we can get out of it, I don't know. Maybe you younger people in the years to come will change it. But at the moment, I'm sorry to say, 2023 is a repeat of it's a question of history repeating itself again. So I don't see in the immediate or even medium term a change in our politics, regrettably.
Well, thank you for answering that question. Let's hear from Tom this morning. Good morning, Tom. What's your question to Dr. Mandaza? Tom, are you there? Okay, let's go to Ghetto. Good morning, Ghetto. What's your question to Dr. Mandaza?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I would like to find out from Mr. Mandaza. He's been talking about the ZANU-PF party, not government, but the party being intolerant. What does he say about the opposition, which is in the opposition, that is also intolerant of other opposition parties? For example, I'm sure he's on Twitter, he's on these spaces. He has seen the barrage of insults that were meted on when Chapman came into the space. Right now, we've got a lady, Valerio. She gets insulted. We've had Linda, who's been insulted, and the insults are based on some imaginary taking away voters from them. because I think that the opposition stands for what they call democracy, a democratic entity. But when somebody else comes in as opposition, that is highly intolerated. It's so scary. It's very scary. Then secondly, I would ask him to say, wasn't R.G. Mugabe much more influential, much more loved, much more popular within ZANU-PF, such that when he went to vote for Chamisa, I'm sure he would have taken, like you are saying, that the ZANU-PF was split in half. I'm sure he would have taken the whole half with him and then voted for Chamisa, and it would have affected Idi's party. So, are you saying that Kasukuwere is more popular than the former president? Thanks.
Uh, Let me start with that last question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please, you go ahead, Doctor.
I think it's less to do with Kasukuwere, in my view, than about Emerson Mnangagwa himself, as I explained earlier on. In other words, one, Mugabe is still a factor, as he showed in 2018. I was surprised myself. I was one of those who thought Mugabe had lost his gloss long ago. And indeed, I don't think even though he was popular in many areas, that was popular enough to have won elections since 2000. I doubt that. But still, he remained a fact, and we saw that in 2018. Now, to the extent that social base remains in place, one can safely say that that's the kind of constituency, the kind of social base that's likely to respond to Kasukuwere if he's allowed to stand, and therefore it's that which would become very pronounced if he's allowed to stand, and therefore Mnangagwa has reason to be afraid of losing that vote. Secondly, there's also there are people who would have voted for Chamisa because of their aversion to Mnangagwa. Now it's likely that those would also vote for Kasukuwere. So if he's allowed to stand, I would say that Kasukuwere would get no less than 30% of the vote, and that would certainly complicate the outcome and force a runoff. As the first question, yes, I am aware of the intolerance within the opposition itself. In many cases, the opposition behaves no different from ZANU-PF in terms of this intolerance towards opponents. And I would say it was disgraceful that elements in Triple C were crying out loud against people like Chapman, who's a fine young man. I got to know him. Intolerant. That's why I was saying earlier on. It's a bit. I wish we had a proportionate representation. We would have more of these fine people. In the small parties, in government. In parliament. So yes, I acknowledge, as you do, the intolerance that also characterizes the opposition.
Well, thanks so much, Doctor, for the response. But let me just go back to my course now. Not the issue of manifestos. Let's talk about the issue of importance of manifestos, right? I'm saying to myself, 29 days before the elections, and the two major biggest in quotes political parties in Zimbabwe, they haven't released their manifestos. NPF and Triple C, they haven't released their manifestos. We've only seen UNZA, ZAPU. Also, have seen what to call this one, another party. Kasukuwere also released a manifesto this morning. What does it mean for a Democrat? What does it mean for the electorate? Some of us vote based on manifestos. Yeah. But we have the two major biggest parties in Zimbabwe, Triple C and NPF. They haven't released their manifesto. What does this mean for our Democrats and for elections in Zimbabwe? Doc, want to respond to that?
Yes, I've already answered that. I mean, it shows how poor our politics are. You know, that is, the politics have been reduced to a mere competition for power, competition to stay in power, competition to take over power, nothing more. And I'm particularly concerned. I can understand ZANU-PF being very comfortable holding state power as they do, and therefore they don't have to say anything. You know, they want to retain power for its own end. But I'm a bit disappointed that the opposition, the main opposition movement, Triple C, has not been very explicit about its policies. You know, apart from criticizing the current regime, you know, and by implication saying, well, we're going to do differently. We will run the economy differently and so on. But I think, as you said rightly, the population needs to be addressed by a clear statement of intent, a clear statement of policies against which they can be judged for the election itself, but also subsequent to the election, in terms of the promise they've made. Now, I can see also why ZANU-PF would not want to have a manifesto that might expose itself more than it has already, in terms of the extent to which ZANU-PF has been overwhelmed, or the state has been overwhelmed by its own failure. You know, and I noticed the opposition newspapers citing promises made in 2018 which have not been achieved. You also notice the Nick Mangwana tweets. Each time Mnangagwa goes to a particular province, built so many dams, built so many things, built a new airport, and so on and so forth. All these are meant indirectly to exude a kind of manifesto. But yes, it's sad that our politics have been reduced to a non-manifesto politics, non-manifesto elections. So there you have it.
Well, thank you so much for responding to that. Let's hear from Munamato. Good morning, Munamato. What's your question to Dr. Mandaza this morning?
Thank you, Site. Good morning to everyone. Baba Mandaza, good morning, sir.
Morning.
How are you doing? Hope you are well. Thank you. Baba Mandaza, I have always regarded you to be one of the most progressive thinkers, non-political thinkers that we have in the country. And
thank you.
Thank you so much. Although Baba Mandaza, I'm a little bit concerned, if not disappointed, by our current political situation, just like as you are, and also looking at the idea of we have got two main political parties, and this is my view in terms of journalism, just throughout the whole country, that we have always paraded these two political parties is either Nelson Chamisa because he's popular, or is ZANU-PF because they're arrogant, staying in power. But we have got other 10 players, and sorry to say, but of the 9 players remaining of the 10, in my view, some of the other guys are just mere dreamers by the virtue of that particular notion that everyone had this dream of becoming the second president after RG. Then we have got, in my view, the only political candidate that is there, that stands, which is President Elizabeth Varelio. The reason why I say so, I don't know. You were talking about that most political parties haven't put up their manifestos, and for me, it just doesn't end on manifestos. It goes to action plans, it goes to executable plans, the charters, and various policies, not just for Zimbabwe, but for external, and also some other smaller, finer details inside. And when honestly I look at all the 12, there's only, in my view, one person who has done their extensive research to do laying down the vision properly, and that is Press Elizabeth Valerio, who's the only female candidate standing there. So in the question that I have for you is, I know you talk about that these small political parties need representation and stuff, and we refer them to small by virtue of their popularity, not by the virtue of their policies, not by the virtue of what they stand for. But one of the things that I've seen in the past, even with ZANU PF when Mugabe was there, there was the idea of endorsement. And endorsement speaks of a lot of people that have got a voice, endorses a particular individual, and then everyone gravitates to it. Brighton just mentioned how when the late RG went to vote for Mugabe, a lot of people, I mean, RG went to vote for Nelson Chamisa. Potentially, a lot of people went to vote for Nelson Chamisa as well. And as I regard you to be one of the people that has got a very powerful voice within the country, my question is, who are you endorsing in this election, and on what principle are you endorsing them? Because that for us, even those that are listening here, also adds up to an understanding to say, okay, progressively where our country can be. Because as I say that, I regard you as a progressive thinker in our country, someone who sees into the future and thinks about the future. So from the 12 that we already have, who are you endorsing, and what principle? That is my question to you, sir.
My vote is my secret. I can't tell who I will vote
Endorsing,
for.
sir, not voting. And
I first of all, I regret very much that we don't have proportional representation, and because I see the opposition. You mentioned Valerio, you mentioned Chapman. I think these are fine people, and I still hope that whoever wins becomes president, to form a government, he or she will include these people in some form in government. So yes, I am happy to see that there are 11 candidates in the election, and to the extent that they have been gazetted, I think they are viable factors, and gives the public, the voter, including myself, a chance to look at them and decide on voting day whom I vote for. I will let you know after the election.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mandaza, for.
We seem to have lost him there. No speaking. Doctor, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Were you done?
Yes, I'm done.
Okay, cool. Maybe before we wrap up the show this morning, the issue of the primary elections from ZANU PF and also the candidate selection process, like there have been many issues around double candidates from Triple C areas because of the citizen caucus meetings of saying they're caucusing from the different communities and selecting their candidates. What do you think works for Zimbabweans now? By elections, not by primary elections, versus the Triple C method of selecting candidates. What works better, and what can you say about the Triple C process that are done?
I think the Triple C process of people standing in the preferred candidate, I think that was really backward, in my view. Really, it shocked me actually that Triple C used that method, an outdated method, and I think it's a big slur on their character as a political party. But in general, the way primaries that we've run in this country leaves a lot to be desired. You notice, for example, in some areas, only about 300 people were involved. In a constituency of 39,000, 300 people were the ones who took part in primaries. So it raises questions, serious questions, about the democratic nature of, or the lack of it, of the processes. So I'm sorry, I attach little or no importance to primaries as a democratic process.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Mandaza, for coming through and answering to all these questions about the elections and giving us an overview of our media our political landscape. Brighton is still a question.
Yeah, before you go,
Yeah.
last question from me before you go this morning. As you go to cast our voice come 23rd of August, I know you have Zimbabwe at heart. I know you're Patrick Zimbabwean yourself. You've been voting, you've been vocal about many things in Zimbabwe. Let's speak about the quality of candidates. What should we look into the ballot box in terms of quality of candidates? How important is quality in terms of candidate selection process?
It's very important, but I'm not sure that we have the best of talent in the candidates that are standing for elections. One of the things which we didn't talk about in the last hour is the issue of the diaspora, which has not been allowed to, which has been denied the vote. The diaspora, some 5 million, 4.5 to 5 million people out there. And in fact, significantly, 75% of all professional and skilled Zimbabweans, 75% of all professional and skilled Zimbabweans are outside the country, the diaspora. Secondly, the diaspora accounts for almost 2 billion a year, US dollars, in remittances. And if we have this very important section of our population out there, it means that the quality of leadership in the country is likewise depleted. So I doubt that we have the best of Zimbabweans standing for elections. Maybe one or the here and there, but generally, one can say prima facie that the quality of our candidates is not up to it. We are a broken country. We're a depleted country. Especially depleted of the right people in the civil society, the right people who should be standing for elections. And you can see people like Chapman, Valerio. These are people coming from outside the country. We hope that more and more, and certainly I hope that the new government in August will make certain two things: that the diaspora is afforded a vote,
Dr. Mandaza,
yes, thanks.
So thanks so much for your time, for coming through to this morning this morning.
Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much to all the guests that came through this morning to speak to us around the issue of elections, and also thanks to Dr. Mandaza for coming through to speak to us about Zimbabwe elections. So the lovely conversation that we had with him this morning. We spoke about the issue of manifestos, the issue of quality of candidates, the issue of the previous elections that we have had in Zimbabwe, and also observation of elections in Zimbabwe. It's quite interesting conversation we had.
Quite an interesting one, Brighton, and I really hope that we get to see, that vibrancy, that vigor in terms of competition, in terms of participation in these elections. Yeah?
But also the issue of manifestos. 29 days before the polls, we haven't received any manifesto from the two biggest parties in Zimbabwe. For me, according to Mandaza, this was like the poverty of politics.
Yeah,
the condition of popularism, issue of drones, issue of numbers. But what about the ideas? What about the policies?
Yeah.
We haven't seen and heard about issue of policies from the two parties in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF and Triple C. Anyway, guys, for myself, Brighton, it's been lovely out with you this morning. Please do head to our Facebook page to watch the Breakfast Club, and also to follow us for also the election debate series, where we are coming to different communities in Bulawayo and interviewing your candidates, aspiring councillors in different wards across Bulawayo.
Yes, and from myself, Nonhlanhla
and Brighton,
it's bye for now.